They weren't supposed to fail, so why did they? Some of the biggest shows of the 1970s didn't collapse on their own. They were quietly weakened by spin-offs that should have worked, but didn't. What begins as expansion turns into something forced, something off. In this video, you'll see 15 spin-offs that didn't just miss, they reshaped the originals. And one of them didn't just fail, it erased what came before. Gloria, 1975. At first, it feels like a continuation. A character stepping forward, a story moving on. Gloria comes from All in the Family, carrying emotional weight from one of television's most intense family dynamics. But something changes immediately. Because Gloria, outside that environment, feels different. The tension that defined her, her constant opposition, her emotional reactions, her place within conflict, no longer exists in the same way. And without that pressure, the character softens. The world around her becomes quieter, more stable, less confrontational, and that stability removes what made her compelling. It's not that she changes, it's that the environment does. And once that environment is gone, the energy fades with it. What remains feels familiar, but lighter, less urgent, and slowly, the connection weakens. Fish, 1977. Some characters feel strong because of contrast. Fish comes from Barney Miller, where the character worked as part of a controlled ensemble. His personality stood out because it clashed with others. That friction gave him weight. But here, that friction is reduced. The environment shifts, the tone softens, and instead of reacting to a system, the character becomes the center of it, and that changes everything. Because what once felt sharp now feels isolated. The interactions lose tension, the pacing slows, the unpredictability fades. It's not a dramatic failure, it's a structural one. Because the character wasn't designed to lead, he was designed to respond. And once that response is removed, the balance disappears. What remains feels familiar, but not as effective. Rhoda, 1974. Some spin-offs feel like a natural continuation until they start pulling attention away from the original. Rhoda comes directly from the Mary Tyler Moore Show, taking one of its most grounded, relatable characters and placing her at the center. At first, it works, because Rhoda feels real, immediate, easy to follow, the tone is accessible, the story feels personal. But something shifts over time, because the original relied on balance, multiple personalities, multiple perspectives, all colliding in one shared space. Here, that balance narrows. The focus tightens around one emotional viewpoint. And while that creates clarity, it also reduces contrast. The world feels smaller. And as Rhoda grows in popularity, it begins to stand on its own so strongly that the original starts to feel less central. That's the hidden effect. Not failure, but displacement. Because when a spin-off becomes equally recognizable, it splits the identity of what came before. And once that split happens, the original no longer feels singular. It becomes one version among many. Maude, 1972. Some spin-offs succeed at first and still cause damage later. Maude emerges from All in the Family, carrying over one of its most outspoken characters. At the beginning, it works. The tone is sharp. The writing is bold. It feels like a natural extension. But something shifts over time. Because All in the Family thrived on contrast, multiple perspectives colliding in the same space. That tension created balance. Conflict had weight because it wasn't one-sided. Here, that balance narrows. The perspective becomes more focused, more controlled. And without opposing forces strong enough to challenge it, the dynamic changes. What once felt like debate starts to feel like direction. And that subtle shift alters how the original is remembered. Because spin-offs don't exist in isolation. They reshape the legacy of what came before. Maude didn't fail in the traditional sense, but it contributed to something quieter, a fragmentation of tone. Where the original felt layered, this feels singular. And that difference matters. Because once a world splits into separate voices, it stops feeling unified. And something essential gets lost in that divide. Out of the blue, 1979. An angel appears, not as metaphor, not as symbolism, but as a literal character, inserted into a grounded sitcom world. And that's where everything begins to disconnect. Introduced through Happy Days, the concept already feels unstable. The original show worked because it was familiar, predictable in a comforting way. This isn't. The tone shifts unpredictably. Reality bends without explanation. And instead of enhancing the story, the concept pulls attention away from it. Every scene feels like it's asking the same question. Why is this happening? And the show never fully answers. Good, because the idea itself isn't integrated, it's imposed. That's the difference. Spin-offs work when they grow naturally from the original. This one interrupts it, and audiences feel that interruption immediately. Not as confusion, but as distance. They don't lean in, they pull back. And once that distance forms, it's hard to close. The show doesn't last. But the attempt remains. A reminder that even one wrong idea can shift an entire world out of place. The Jeffersons, 1975. Some spin-offs don't just expand a world, they shift its center entirely. The Jeffersons comes from All in the Family, taking side characters and placing them in a new environment. On the surface, it feels like a natural continuation. Same universe, same social themes. But the shift is bigger than it seems. It's because All in the Family worked through contrast, multiple viewpoints clashing inside one confined space. That tension created unpredictability. Here, the structure changes. The Jeffersons move upward, socially, financially, physically. The setting becomes more stable, more controlled, and with that, the dynamic shifts. The friction that once defined their presence is reduced. Because they're no longer reacting to the same world, they're separated from it. And separation changes perspective. The tone becomes more focused, more singular, less dependent on opposition. That's where the difference forms, not in quality, but in balance. Because when a spin-off removes characters from the tension that defined them, it reshapes how they function, and how the original is remembered. The Jeffersons didn't fail, but it contributed to something quieter, a fragmentation of tone across the same universe. Where one story felt layered, this feels contained. And once a world splits like that, it stops feeling whole. Phyllis, 1975. Some characters feel larger than they are, until they're placed at the center. Phyllis worked inside the Mary Tyler Moore Show because she wasn't the focus. She disrupted scenes, added tension, created imbalance in a controlled way. But here, everything revolves around her. And that shift exposes something unexpected. Without the ensemble to push against, the character becomes repetitive. The same traits that once felt sharp now feel exaggerated. What used to be contrast becomes the entire tone. And tone, without variation, becomes predictable. The environment changes. The structure softens. And instead of evolving, the character remains static, looping through the same behaviors without progression. That's where the fatigue begins. Because audiences don't just want familiarity, they want movement. And this show doesn't move forward, it circles. Even critical recognition couldn't fully stabilize it, because the issue wasn't performance, it was placement. Phyllis wasn't broken, the context was. And when context collapses, even strong characters lose their impact. Not instantly, but gradually, until the energy that once made them stand out starts to feel like repetition. The Ropers, 1979. Remove the pressure, and the humor changes. Mr. and Mrs. Roper thrived inside Three's company because of contrast. Their reactions, their suspicions, their constant interaction with chaos. They weren't the chaos, and they responded to it. Now, that chaos is gone, and without it, something subtle disappears. The tension that made every exchange feel unpredictable. The new setting is quieter, more controlled, but also less dynamic. Conversations stretch, moments linger longer than they should, and slowly, the rhythm breaks. Because comedy depends on timing, and timing depends on pressure. Without that pressure, scenes lose urgency. Jokes feel slower, reactions feel less sharp. It's not that the characters change, it's that the world around them does. And that world matters more than it seems. Audiences notice the difference, even if they can't fully explain it. Something feels off, less alive, and once that feeling sets in, it's hard to reverse. The show doesn't collapse instantly, it fades. And in that fade, but it reveals something important, that some characters aren't meant to lead. They're meant to react. Take that away, and the entire structure shifts. Tabitha, 1977. Legacy can carry a show, but only for so long. Tabitha continues the world of Bewitched, shifting focus to the next generation. On paper, it feels natural. Familiar universe, recognizable premise. But something doesn't translate. The original worked because of restraint. Magic used carefully, layered into everyday life. It created contrast, balance. Here, that balance shifts. The concept becomes more obvious, more direct, less subtle, and with that, the charm begins to fade. Because mystery matters, and once it's reduced, the world feels smaller. The characters echo what came before, but without the same weight. The situations feel similar, but not as impactful. It's not a collapse, it's a dilution. And dilution is harder to notice, but just as effective. Audiences don't reject it outright. They disengage slowly, because what they're seeing isn't new enough to excite, and not original enough to feel necessary. It exists in between, and that space is unstable, because in television, being almost familiar isn't enough to survive. Good Times, 1974. At the beginning, it feels like a natural extension. Familiar world, familiar tone, a continuation that makes sense. Good Times comes from Maud, which itself comes from All in the Family, a chain of expansion, each step moving slightly further from the original core. And that distance matters. Because with each layer, something changes. The tone shifts, the focus narrows, or the identity becomes more specific, but also more isolated. At first, the show feels grounded, real, centered on family and struggle. But as it progresses, something subtle begins to happen. The balance starts to tilt. Characters that were once part of an ensemble begin to dominate. Humor becomes broader. Situations become more exaggerated. And slowly, the original intention begins to blur. Because spin-offs don't just inherit identity, they reshape it. And when that reshaping leans too far in one direction, it changes how everything connected to it is perceived. That's the hidden risk of expansion chains. Not immediate failure, but gradual distortion, where each new version feels slightly different, until the original foundation becomes harder to recognize. And by then, it's already changed. Laverne and Shirley, 1976. But some spin-offs feel effortless, at least in the beginning. Laverne and Shirley grows out of Happy Days, taking side characters and giving them their own space. And early on, it works. The energy is fast, the chemistry is clear, the tone feels lively. But success brings expansion, and expansion brings pressure. Because once a spin-off becomes popular, it starts carrying more than it was designed for. The tone stretches, the humor intensifies, situations grow larger, louder, more exaggerated. And with that shift, something subtle changes. The grounded simplicity of Happy Days begins to feel distant. Because this version isn't reacting to that world anymore. It's building its own. And in doing so, it moves further away from what made the original feel stable. That's the paradox of successful spin-offs. They don't just grow, they redefine. And when that redefinition becomes stronger than the source, it changes how the source is remembered. Not negatively, but differently. And sometimes, that's enough to alter the legacy completely. Sanford Arms, 1977. Remove the core, and the structure collapses. Sanford Arms attempts to continue the world of Sanford and Son, but without its central character. And that absence is immediate, because the original didn't just rely on setting or supporting cast. It relied on presence. Fred Sanford wasn't just part of the show, he was the dynamic. Without him, the environment remains, but the energy doesn't. The interactions feel quieter, less reactive, less driven. Because the tension that once fueled every scene is gone. And without tension, structure weakens. The show tries to compensate. New characters, for new situations. But something essential is missing. Because you can't replicate presence. You can recreate the space. You can rebuild the format. But you can't replace what defined it. That's where the failure becomes clear. not in execution, but in absence. Because sometimes a show isn't built on concept, it's built on one person, and once that person is gone, everything else struggles to hold. Happy Ever After, 1974. Continuation sounds safe, but safety can become repetition. Happy Ever After emerges directly from For the Love of Ada, carrying over the same characters, the same dynamic, the same emotional tone. On the surface, that continuity feels reassuring. Familiar faces, familiar rhythm, nothing disrupted. And that's the problem. Nothing changes. The relationship that once felt new now feels settled. What once carried uncertainty now feels resolved. Conflict softens into routine. Situations echo earlier moments without adding anything new. And without escalation, the story begins to loop back on itself. Because familiarity needs contrast. Without contrast, tension fades. Scenes unfold exactly as expected. Dialogue lands, but without surprise. Moments that once carried emotional weight begin to feel lighter, then routine, then predictable. It's not a collapse, it's a flattening, and flattening is quieter, but just as final. There's no dramatic failure, no sharp decline. Instead, there's a gradual loss of energy. The kind that isn't immediately visible, but becomes impossible to ignore over time. Audiences don't reject it loudly. They drift away. Because what they're watching isn't evolving. It's repeating. And repetition, without progression, slowly removes the reason to keep watching. That's the real risk of continuation. Not failure, but stagnation. The Rookie's spin-off, 1970s. Success creates patterns, and patterns create copies. The Rookies helped define a style, procedural, structured, grounded in realism. It worked because it felt immediate, focused. Every episode carried a sense of direction. Cases moved forward with purpose. Decisions had weight. But success doesn't just attract attention. It invites imitation. And what followed wasn't evolution. It was repetition across the industry. Spin-offs and similar extensions began to mirror the formula without expanding it. The structure remained intact. The same pacing, the same character types, the same resolution patterns. But something less visible began to fade. Urgency. Because urgency doesn't come from format. It comes from perspective. And once multiple shows begin telling stories the same way, that perspective narrows. Scenes feel familiar before they even begin. Outcomes feel expected before they unfold. That's where the shift happens. Not in quality, but in distinction. Because originality matters more than structure. And once that originality disappears, everything starts to feel interchangeable. That's what happened here. Not one failure, but many small ones. Shows that looked the same, moved the same, resolved the same, until the differences stopped registering. And when that happens, attention doesn't collapse. It drifts quietly, gradually, because audiences don't always reject repetition. They disengage from it, and once something becomes predictable, it becomes replaceable. And the Partridge Family animated universe in the 1970s. This is where it stops feeling accidental. Not one spin-off, not one shift. A pattern. The Partridge Family begins as something grounded. Family, music, relatability. It works because it feels contained, focused. The appeal isn't spectacle, it's simplicity. A format that doesn't need to stretch to survive. But success changes expectations. Suddenly, staying the same doesn't feel like enough. Expansion begins. First subtle, then more visible. Then harder to ignore. Animation, sci-fi. Reinvention layered on top of reinvention. And with each version, something small disappears. Not all at once, not enough to notice immediately, but enough to shift the balance. The tone drifts, the identity stretches, the core weakens. What once felt specific starts to feel adaptable. And adaptability sounds like strength, until it removes definition. Because the more a concept can become anything, the less it feels like something. That's where the transition happens. Quietly, gradually, until what remains doesn't feel like the original at all. Not broken, just altered. That's the difference between growth and overextension. Growth builds on what exists. It deepens, it sharpens, it protects the foundation while adding to it. Overextension replaces. It trades identity for reach. It expands outward, but leaves the center exposed. And here, replacement doesn't happen suddenly. It happens in layers, each new version pulling slightly further away from what made the original work. Until eventually, the original stops feeling like the source. It becomes one version among many. And that's what makes this number one. Not because it failed the hardest, but because it revealed something more permanent. That success doesn't always collapse a show. Sometimes it stretches it so far that it forgets what it was. Some spin-offs fail instantly. Others take something with them when they go. And that's what makes these different. They didn't just miss the mark. They changed how the originals were remembered. Which one surprised you the most? Let me know below. And if you want more deep dives into forgotten TV mistakes, subscribe and stay curious.